So, hello, this is Yuri Skaja speaking to you from Riga, Latvia. Where else? Well, a couple of interesting things today, June the 14th. Must say that June the 14th is one of the truly dark days in Latvian history because in 1941, uh, almost at the end of the first year of Latvia being occupied and then later annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940, uh, the Soviet authorities deported um, more than 15,000 people to Siberia from this country. Men, women, children, anyone who was involved with the military, the government, so forth and so on. I believe even the youngest person to be deported was actually a newborn um, who was born on the 14th of June, as the mother was literally taken out of a maternity hospital or wherever. Although that is just a story that I read today, when, as on every June 14th, the Latvian media has some sort of commemorative uh, story or news item or feature on television. Um, in one sense, uh, it's lucky that we had the whole COVID pandemic and emergency this year rather than next, because next year would be 80 years of uh, since the deportations of June 1941, and it would be a shame not to be able to have a full commemoration of this tragic event. That's not so much tragic. It was not something that happened in and of itself. It was a political, deliberate decision by Stalin's government to do this to Latvia and as well to the other two Baltic countries. Lithuania and Estonia also saw mass deportations. The sad thing is, of course, that there's not only the Soviet KGB and the Red Army or whatever else was involved in this, but there were also local informers and local helpers who, out in the smaller villages and towns of Latvia, denounced their neighbors and saw that they were taken away. Anyway, the other important thing to remember, and especially when next year rolls around, it'll be 80 years since both the occupation of Latvia. Well, it was 80. It will be 80 years in next week since June 17th, 1940, when the Red Army sort of rolled into the country after making a few ultimatums, and the president of Latvia at the time, Kārlis Ulmanis, who had taken power in an authoritarian coup, said, "Well, so the Russians are coming. You stay wherever you are, and I'll stay where I am, and sort of we'll see what happens." Well, what happened is what I just described to you. Uh, Latvia told its army to stand down. It told its air force, with about 150 combat aircraft, to stand down. Maybe wisely, maybe not, because the way things looked in 1940, when there had been concessions made already to let in Soviet troops and bases in Latvia, and when there was no clear unity among the three Baltic states and possibly Finland and Poland as to how to deal with these two increasingly dangerous neighbors to the east and to the west, namely Nazi Germany and Stalin's Russia. Well, maybe fighting would have at least made the point that we were not uh, voluntarily accepted into the Soviet Union, but it would have meant a huge loss of life and damage to this country. But, we can't replay history. Another interesting side effect and a rather lasting side effect of the fact that this deportations took place on June the 14th, 1941, is that on June the 22nd, 1941, is when the Germans, or Nazi Germany, invaded the Soviet Union. And of course, by the end of June, the Wehrmacht and the German forces entered Latvia. And one could say, historically and objectively, that the old oppressor and enemy of the Latvian people, the Germans, the overlords, were back. But this was not at all the reaction, given what the Soviets had done. And not only the deportations, but arrests and repression and suppression of any kind of political activity and a general atmosphere of terror across the country, uh, made the Latvians spontaneously go out and welcome the Germans. I mean, these guys. I mean, how could they possibly be worse than what had already been happening? And the June the 14th sort of is stamped itself or burned itself into the memory, the collective memory of Latvians, and well, it led to subsequent very unfortunate events. Namely that the whole arrival of the German Nazi regime, or well, not politically Nazi regime, but that's who was in Berlin, was viewed as a kind of liberation. Some attempts to try to set up a Latvian government or whatever in the interim were quickly repressed by the Germans, but that sort of went by the boards. And then in 1943-44, when the Germans needed manpower, there were quite a few Latvians who were ready to be drafted into the Waffen SS to fight the evil approaching Red Army, which they knew what those guys had done in 1941. Um, there were also people who whose anger and horror at what was going on was misdirected by German intelligence services and agitators and whatever into some of these so-called spontaneous acts of retribution against the Jewish population here. The irony of it is that among the 15,000 people who were deported to Siberia in June of 1941, a disproportionate number, something like 12%, were Jewish Latvians. That is to say, people who were overrepresented because only about 5% of the population gave their religious affiliation as Jewish, and even to some extent their ethnic affiliation, because a lot of the Jews in Latvia spoke Yiddish or German or whatever as kind of their primary language. But those people were taken away in 1941, not so much because, or maybe even not at all, because they were Jewish, but they were taken away because they were fairly well off. There were politicians, there were business people, there were lawyers, there were some of them were even officers in the Latvian army and the Latvian Home Guard, and that was enough. What happened afterwards, the Holocaust in Latvia, you just had to be Jewish. That was all. Then you were on the list for destruction, which is a bit of a different game that the Nazis were playing as to what the communists were playing. And of course, it did not help that the Nazi propaganda could come up and say, "Oh, look, there were a couple of Jewish folks who signed off on the deportations. Never mind that as I said, in some villages it was, Jan is down the street who denounced his neighbors, but then, there was this image of the evil Jewish communists were involved in this. So this was an iconic event, these deportations, in a kind of multifaceted way, both good and evil. Good that Latvians knew that the Soviet Union was their enemy, among others, and bad in that it poisoned people's minds in a certain direction and then led to other tragic and disastrous events for this country and nation. Well, that's so much for what we have had going on as a kind of an annual event or annual commemoration here. Yesterday, some 300 law enforcement personnel, probably most of them police officers and police detectives, went out to about 45 or 46 places in Latvia and did searches and raids on apparently a network of money laundering operations that was set up through the now liquidated or in the process of liquidation bank ABLV. Now, ABLV is the bank that the Treasury Department's FinCEN, with a report that indicated there was a lot of shenanigans going on in the bank, including financing missile parts for North Korea and other stuff that warms the hearts of the American Treasury Department, was going on there. That bank was then basically shut down within about a week in 2018. And then it has gone into a somewhat dubious process of self liquidation. And, well, we'll see. But according to some press reports, there's more than €1 billion in assets, having all the sort of legitimate depositors and deposit holders at ABLV having been paid off under deposit insurance in Latvia. That, nobody really knows what this money was there for and who, what was the source of the funds and so forth and so on. And that's a substantial part of the assets of the bank. And I think this is what is now unraveling. Now people are finding, that the whole banking operation, or much of the banking operation of ABLV, was a big, giant laundromat for money, most likely coming from Russia and Belarus. There was a recent operation in January, again raids all over the place at as yesterday, or as on Saturday, against ABLV's big office building and ABLV's official headquarters in another part of the town. Same was done in January, and that involved just looking for people and also detaining and sort of preliminary criminal charges being filed against people who laundered some 50 million euro or equivalent of funds obtained from tax evasion and fraud in Belarus and Russia. And this was something outside the purview of what the FinCEN thing was about. So we'll see how all of this ends. I mean, we'll see if this whole €1 billion+ mystery swamp that has, been kept sort of in a holding tank at ABLV, how this is drained and how it all ends. Well, that's about all of the notable or semi-notable events here in Latvia. Again, it was the first week that we were off the COVID emergency, so there could be larger outdoor gatherings, which of course means that at least the entire 100-member Latvian parliament could, keeping socially distanced, walk over to the Latvian Freedom Monument and put down flowers in memory of the victims of the June 1914 deportations and all of that. Well, the town will liven up. Summer is coming. The annual Midsummer Festival will be celebrated about less than 10 days from now, and hopefully it will not lead to mass public gatherings and any kind of reinfection, but we'll see. So that's that from Latvia for now. This is Juris Kaja in Riga.